Shalom and welcome. Welcome to our special community program, A Conversation with Dr. David Frey. I am Kathy Kimball-Worster, the director of the Support Anti-Semitism Initiative for Jewish Federation of Greater Orange County. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. For those of you joining us virtually, may I add from all over the world, please know that this program is being recorded. In addition, your microphones are muted, and we ask that you type your questions for Dr. Frey in the chat. For those of you joining us in person, the restrooms are in the lobby, and the emergency exits are in the back of the room to the right and to the left. There are also water bottles in the hallway. You will have opportunities to ask questions, and we will assist you so that all may hear your questions. So when you have a question, you can raise your hand, and my husband, Jeff Worcester, will come over to you, and we'll make sure that Dr. Frey can hear your question. I'd like to start by thanking the folks here at Kol Israel for the use of this beautiful sanctuary and facility, especially Mary Jean Dominic, Stephanie Kostenblatt, and Rabbi Cohn. I'd also like to thank our staff here at Jewish Federation, Wendy, Sharon, and Georgia, and the Zachor Committee for all their support, especially our chairperson, Susan Notar, who is the brainchild of this program today. The Zachor Anti-Semitism Initiative is an important part of the Jewish Federation programming and will continue to be because of your generous donations and support. Our mission is to work to prevent anti-Semitism, specifically in Orange County. We also support national and international organizations that fight anti-Semitism. We have plans for more events over the next few months, as our primary goal is centered on education in our schools and in our community. In support of our mission, I'd like to remind all of you that on November 9th, 1938, Kristallnacht, the destruction of over 1,400 synagogues, began. The International March of the Living is sponsoring a Let There Be Light campaign, asking that we all keep the lights on in our houses of worship, institutions, and private homes on November 9th to show unity against anti-Semitism, racism, intolerance, and hatred. Let's shine light over the darkness of hate. That brings me to our main event today, our conversation with Dr. David Frey. Dr. Frey is a history professor at the United States Military Academy here at West Point, right in our own backyard. He's also the director of the Holocaust and Genocide Studies Center at West Point. His focus at the Academy is centered around teaching awareness of, understanding of, and efforts to prevent mass atrocity. He has partnered with the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's initiative on the Holocaust and professional leadership. With the support of the museum and the Department of Defense, he created the Atrocity Prevention Network. He has authored books, academic papers, and won many grants and fellowships. In 2012, he was a Fulbright Research Scholar in Hungary. In 2018, the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum named him one of 7 international agents of change. And by the way, agents of change will also be our topic of our Stop Hate Challenge for middle and high school students this coming year. In addition to working on more than 6 other research projects, he is here today to talk about his Ritchie Boys Project. The formal title of this lecture is Marginal Soldiers, Americanness, Diversity, and Belonging Through the Lens of Camp Ritchie. In May of 2021, he was interviewed by 60 Minutes as the expert on this topic. It is my honor to introduce you to Dr. David Frey.
Well, hello, everyone. I'm honored to be here, especially to be in front of people, which is so different, actual people. I want to thank Kathy, not only for the introduction, but for making all of this happen despite my repeated failures at answering emails. To Wendy for setting everything up and for her calm under pressure as we were experiencing all of these technical difficulties that are inevitable with these sorts of things. to Rabbi Cohn, distinguished guests, to the Orange County Jewish Federation, or Jewish Federation of Orange County, sorry, for organizing this event, and to Kol Israel for actually hosting us in this amazing sanctuary. And thank you to all of those joining from online, wherever you are. I always have to start my talks with a disclaimer. The views expressed today are my own. They do not necessarily reflect official policy or positions of the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, the Department of the Army, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. I will also issue a second disclaimer, which is that I do work for the Army, and so I'm going to present a lot of slides because that's just what we do. And in commemoration, of upcoming commemoration of Kristallnacht, and in honor of those who served for Veterans Day coming up as well, my talk today is going to be about how diversity is a strategic value, a strategic good. Now, I'm going to explain this by introducing you to Camp Ritchie, the military intelligence training camp established by the U.S. Army in World War II. Okay. Sorry if I just want to, thank you. I'm going to focus on what the title says are marginal soldiers, Jewish refugees, recent immigrants, Blacks, Native Americans, Japanese Americans. And I hope to change the way we understand notions of Americanness and belonging, such as those you see voiced on the screen, how they evolved and continue to do so through the experiences of Camp Ritchie and the impact its graduates had on the Cold War era. So that's a lot. I'm not going to do all of that, but I'll try to give you at least an introduction in 4 parts. First, I'll talk about the history of prejudice in the U.S. Army, specifically the Military Intelligence Division, and the broader American society in the period between World War I and World War II. Second, I'll bring us to Camp Ritchie, provide you with a little overview of the training, and introduce you to some of the racial complications of the camp. Third, I'll introduce you to some of the incredible graduates of Camp Ritchie. And fourth, I'll link this research to the work that I do at West Point as director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. Now, that diversity was an inherent good was not the understanding most Americans had in the early part of the 20th century, through the beginning of World War II. The interwar period was one of widespread racism and anti-Semitism, a predominance of nativist and anti-immigrant ideas, a widespread anti-Bolshevik sentiment, and during the interwar era, the Army Officer Corps was small and homogenous, and I'll explain how that figures in momentarily. So if that slide isn't clear, let me reiterate, we were an incredibly racist and anti-Semitic country with a largely uniform leadership class. That was the norm in the interwar. Leading thinkers in the late 1800s and early 1900s, some of whom you see here, were racists and eugenics experts. These men argued that there were fundamental physical and intellectual differences that were traceable to genetic origins of the so-called races, which meant something very different to them at that time than it means to us today. So for example, Italians and Jews were considered to be separate races, which we don't make that argument today. These men further argued that even within races, there were inherent inequalities that could not be overcome by education or socialization. In some cases, they argued against democracy. They all believed in segregation and opposed any sort of miscegenation or race mixing. Several argued that overpopulation and resource competition made war natural and that the fittest races would survive. They were what we call social Darwinists. Several believed in negative eugenics, meaning they endorsed actions to prevent the births of certain groups of people, such as forced sterilization or abortion. And these were not marginal thinkers. These were mainstream thinkers at the time. Some of those were influenced by or in correspondence with individuals who were leading figures in the US Army and West Point. The work of Army Dr. Charles Woodruff, some of whose conclusions I'll show you momentarily, was highly regarded by the War Department General Staff through the late 1930s. Major General Connor, pictured here, was an outright social Darwinist. He regularly invited Woodruff to speak at the Army War College, which trained the general staff officers who ran the Army. Connor himself brought these ideas with him to West Point, where as superintendent, he periodically lectured on scientific racism. Woodruff too lectured at West Point, where he likely made remarks such as these. Now, for the benefit of those online, I'll read them. But his remarks are, "The Jew, then, is the typical illustration of a commensal race, welcomed as long as he renders a returning benefit, but driven out or killed off as soon as he becomes so numerous that he is a harmful parasite and national disease. European nations have repeatedly undergone a process of disinfection in this regard. The same law applies to the Jew as applies to a bacillus or any other organism, which may be beneficial if few and in place, but deadly if numerous and out of place. Just as soon as he becomes so numerous as to be an economic disease, he is eradicated. The persecution of the Jew, then, is and always has been a natural law because it is necessary for the survival of the supporting organism. It is not persecution of the Jew as Jew, but an extermination of an invading disease." These are the comments of an Army doctor, a leading Army doctor, not someone from Nazi Germany. These are ideas that influenced those in Nazi Germany. But how did these ideas impact Army leadership? In a 1920 letter to a colleague, Colonel William McCain wrote, "The trouble is, the master race is on decline and gradually ceasing to be master in its own house. It is being swamped by mongrels, greasers, whelps, and hounds." McCain's fear was very specific, that white, quote, Nordic Protestant true Americans were losing control of something they rightfully claimed and possessed by dint of, quote, conquest, merit, heritage, and even divine providence. These ideas were widespread and even taught throughout the military. Not only did West Point host Dr. Woodruff through the late 1930s, but prominent racists and eugenicists, like the ones I pictured earlier, Henry Rothschild and Lothrop Stoddard, taught biological racism at the Army and Navy war colleges. And these ideas were taught precisely to the so-called Nordic Protestants, Americans that McCain spoke about. Through the 1930s, the large majority of Army officers were, in fact, Anglo-Saxon Protestants of middle or upper class background. These men espoused basic social Darwinist concepts, that races were inherently unequal, and that the war, not peace, was the natural state of being. So we'll hold off for a sec. The obligatory technical difficulty, so excellent, we're moving on. So I'll repeat that. These men espoused basic social Darwinist concepts, that races were inherently unequal and that war, not peace, was the natural state of being. Several historians have argued that these biases and beliefs were especially prevalent among the second and third generation officers educated at West Point, known at the time as the School for Citizenship, or the Guardian of American National Ideals. For example, those educated at West Point in the pre-World War I and World War I era, including the very famous class of 1915, the supposed class the stars fell upon, which included Eisenhower, Bradley, and 57 other general officers, all were directly exposed to Darwinian racist history and political science texts, not to mention race-based biology and ethnography. It was these men who led the World War II Army. These attitudes often resulted in officers having very myopic ideas of what being American actually meant. Their ideas of citizenship, in fact, may not have extended to many of you in this room. But it would be unfair to critique just the Army. The period between World War I and World War II was one in which deep prejudice was the norm. There was enormous backlash to the post-World War I initial flood of immigrants to the US. Americans were disillusioned in a broad sense with internationalism. America had experienced or was experiencing a Red Scare, fearing Bolshevik revolution and worried that foreigners would bring communism with them. And there was a conflation of Jews and communism, with anti-communists labeling, quote, Polish and Russian Jews as the carriers of communism. This was the period when Jim Crow laws proliferated throughout the South, when the KKK saw a substantial national revival, when laws restricting Japanese land ownership in California tightened, when calls were made to cut off Mexican immigration, when Henry Ford published hundreds of thousands of copies of what was essentially a reproduction of the infamous anti-Semitic forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And it was a time when social discrimination against Catholics and Jews increased. The interim result you see here was the Immigration Act of 1924, which severely not only limited immigration, which some scholars argue intentionally targeted European Jews, but in fact ended all immigration from Asia, making it impossible for Japanese emigres to become American citizens. And even in the late 1930s and early 1940s, racism, anti-Semitism, and even anti-Catholicism pervaded the highest ranks of the Army and America in general. According to Leonard Dinerstein, anti-Semitism in the US worsened after 1933, and anti-Semitic organizations flourished. In a public opinion poll in 1938, 60% of Americans expressed negative opinions of Jews, finding them, quote, greedy, dishonest, and aggressive, unquote. Organizations like the Christian Front called on its members to, quote, liquidate the Jews in America, and rallies that included members of the Protestant war veterans often ended with Nazi salutes. The German-American Bund rallied nearly 20,000 to Madison Square Garden for a 1939 pro-Nazi event. Assistant Secretary of State Breckinridge Lawn justified making it virtually impossible for German Jews to get visas because he feared the Nazis were using Jews to infect the United States with communism. Even FDR himself, portrayed by the Nazis as a puppet of the Jews, by some virulent American anti-Semites as a secret Jew, and whose New Deal reforms had been tarred as Jewish communism, even he remarked in a private 1942 lunch, quote, you know this is a Protestant country, and the Catholics and Jews here are here under sufferance. Even during the war, polls found that anti-Black and anti-Semitic attitudes remained high, in some cases getting worse as the war went on. And at the highest levels of the War and Navy departments, there was a fear that full integration would, quote, lower or destroy the morale of the white fighting forces. This is the background against which we must understand the Military Intelligence Division. This small, insular organization's members shared widespread American racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and anti-Bolshevism. But what did the Military Intelligence Division do? It mainly oversaw attachés, although it was also involved in collection of intelligence on domestic threats in the United States. Attachés ostensibly reported on developments in the countries in which they worked, but in fact, what they often did was to reiterate anti-Semitic concepts and serve as the conduits for those ideas back to the Army General Staff. In the early 1920s, members of the Military Intelligence Division issued reports opposing Jewish immigration and began what ended up being the creation of some 2,000 files on so-called Jewish issues globally, reports which strengthened anti-immigrant positions of the Army and Congress. The Military Intelligence Division contributed to the public conflation of Jew and communism. Members of the MID prepared military plans for the suppression of revolution in New York City, targeting areas primarily inhabited by Russian Jews, what they called Russian Jews. That was the term they used for basically all Jews. As late as 1936, Military Intelligence Division representatives continued to call the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, quote, valuable intelligence material. The attaché to Nazi Germany, who became one of General Marshall's key wartime advisors on Germany, characterized the work of infamous anti-Semite Houston Stewart Chamberlain as the authoritative work on the, quote, Jewish question. Attachés all over Europe referred to the, quote, Jewish menace to our civilization, Jewish radical and revolutionary tendencies. They critiqued Jews as, quote, dirty malingerers, materialists, and cowards who never were or never will be soldiers. They complained that Jews don't melt in the American melting pot. These positions, argues historian Joseph Bendersky, made military attachés susceptible to bad information that implicated Jews in any way. In other words, it made them bad at intelligence. In fact, the attachés sometimes deployed in opposition to Jewish migration, making their ideas known to politicians, accusing Jewish organizations such as the Joint Distribution Committee or the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society of corruption and fraud, and even issuing a report urging the government to restrict immigration to only those of Nordic stock. These ideas persisted among some, though not all, members of the Military Intelligence Division into the 1930s. Military Intelligence Division New York City chief wrote in 1932 of subversive Jews as a, quote, veritable cesspool of undigestible foreign elements. The father of US military intelligence, Ralph von Damon, remained one of the key voices in the 1930s, urging America to keep Jewish refugees out. General George Van Horn Moseley, one of America's most well-known and controversial pre-World War II generals. He was the deputy chief of staff of the Army and the former commander of the Third Army, created quite a furor when he told a 1938 meeting of reserve officers that because hereditary degeneracy was undermining the gene pool, the, quote, only way we could protect our future should America decide to let Jews in was to sterilize them first. Even after the Army reprimanded Moseley, he continued to call for a worldwide policy to breed Jewish blood out of the human race. He claimed he was not an anti-Semite, only that, quote, the Jew was an internationalist first and a patriot second, and thus could not be trusted. And in June 1939, he told the Dease Committee, the precursor to what became the House Un-American Activities Committee, that a Jewish conspiracy was about to take over the US government, and he urged Roosevelt to actually take authoritative action. Now, these fantasies were reiterated when the war broke out by Military Intelligence Division Chief Colonel Sherman Miles, who used his position to raise alarm about German Jewish refugees serving as a fifth column in the United States. What these attitudes and actions do is to help explain why Congress and the Army initially categorized all unnaturalized Jewish refugees as enemy aliens. This did not change until Congress passed the Second War Powers Act in March of 1942. It explains why we enacted internment of Japanese Americans and why the Army refused to desegregate even in the desperate search for manpower in the early years of war. So that's part one. So given all of this, how did we end up with Camp Ritchie, a military intelligence training camp, or center, excuse me, run by the Military Intelligence Division, which recruited heavily from among Jews, immigrants of all type, and even hosted Blacks, Native Americans, women, and Japanese Americans? To be honest, I don't know. I hope to find answers in the archive this year, and that's what some of my research will involve. The Army's official history of Camp Ritchie doesn't answer this question. A 2004 Christian Bauer documentary about the Ritchie Boys simply says that someone in the War Department had a good idea. And even the most recent and excellent book by my colleague Beverly Eddy doesn't explain who specifically was responsible for the decision to create Camp Ritchie. But there are two figures we know who loomed large: General George Marshall and Brigadier General Raymond Lee, the former defense attaché to Great Britain. Marshall, despite having been taught the same racist eugenicist ideas disguised as science, he graduated from the Virginia Military Institute in 1901. Despite that, he realized that the US Army was at a huge disadvantage in terms of military intelligence. In fact, it had no organized method of training individuals to collect and analyze battlefield information. He recognized something that seems obvious to us today, that those familiar with the language and culture of the enemies could actually be extremely useful. In other words, he recognized the value of diversity. Persuaded by the British field intelligence model and encouraged by then Colonel Raymond Lee, the General Staff, through the Military Intelligence Division, created the Military Intelligence Training Center. Approval came in April 1942. The General Staff then selected Fort Ritchie in Western Maryland and appointed Colonel Charles Banfield to be the commandant. A pilot who had been serving in the War Department General Staff as the chief of its geographic section of the Military Intelligence Division, Banfield had the right credentials, but not necessarily the background to do the job. He was a Floridian who had attended the University of Texas and had spent most of his pre-Army career on bases throughout the Jim Crow South. So he didn't really have the background that would indicate he would recognize the power of diversity. The War Department also brought in British Colonel Thomas Robbins to help design the the Military Intelligence Training Center's curriculum, particularly that relating to interrogation of prisoners of war. Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Chipley directed training, and Major Theodore Fuller was largely responsible for the creation of the curriculum. Fuller himself did recognize that bureaucratic freedom and the value of a diverse staff and student body, remarking that, quote, "We had a lot of leeway for new ideas and innovation." The camp was rapidly refurbished, and it officially opened in June 1942. It graduated its first class of officers in the following months. So welcome to Camp Ritchie. Okay. Before we enter, does anyone have any questions that they want to ask based on the information that I've raised thus far? And if you're online, good chance to get up and stretch. See some things in the chat. So if there are, nope, no questions. Okay, so I'll move on. So Camp Ritchie, who was selected? I've already mentioned recent immigrants, academics, and Americans who had lived abroad were recruited, particularly those who had significant language abilities and scored high on Army intelligence tests. European Jewish refugees made up a significant number of those selected to attend. And of those, German and Austrian Jews were the largest contingent. They knew the German language, culture, geography, and sociology. However, the MTIC, which some individuals jokingly called the Military Institute of Total Confusion, was not just populated by German-speaking Jews. There were speakers of Greek, Italian, Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian, Hungarian, Polish, French, Czechoslovak, Lithuanian, Russian, Norwegian, Armenian, multiple Native American languages, Arabic, Yiddish, Spanish, and that's just the start. The camp was an actual babel of language. The camp included a contingent of WACs, or people, the Women's Army Corps, a small unit of African-American soldiers, and a larger one of Native Americans. One of the first graduates in the first class was Leroy Woodson, an African-American. Accounts differ, but it's safe to say that the majority of Camp Ritchie graduates were either foreign-born or were American-born and had lived abroad for a significant period of time. Most of those selected were simply pulled from their units and sent to Camp Ritchie with little warning and little information. Scores of Ritchie boys recount being told that they were transferring, but that the location was secret and they would just know when they arrived. Some recall writing to the War Department or to FDR directly asking to serve. Can you imagine today writing to the president and expecting that he would respond in the way you wanted? Hans Speer, for example, he illustrates how the Army had a changing relationship with diversity over a short period of time. He enlisted before the war, but because he was a non-naturalized German Jew, he was at first forced to be a medic because once war broke out, he was classified as an enemy alien, so he could not serve with a weapon. Saying he wanted to fight Hitler with a gun and not a syringe, once Congress passed the Second National Security Act, Speer became eligible and was transferred to Camp Ritchie. So what did they study? We're going to go rapidly because that's what they did at Camp Ritchie. They did a lot in a very short period of time. The general course was about 8 weeks long. So of course, they did some basic combat training, including hand-to-hand combat and close combat training. They did signal intelligence, learning Morse code, for example. They did terrain analysis. You see here, putting some of it to use on a night exercise. It's another one of their own developed pieces of literature or training materials just to show the confusion that they expected to deal with in theater. They did aerial photo analysis, which you see here. Sure. That's a really good question. So the question online that came from online was, did Army doctors support the claims that Jews were inferior? I don't know the answer to that. That's a really good question. So I will mark that one down and see if I can find that out. So back to what kinds of training the folks at Camp Ritchie actually did. In addition to the aerial photo analysis, they learned basic staff duties of their own army. They learned counterintelligence. They learned enemy army analysis and order of battle analysis, which I will talk about momentarily. And most importantly, they learned how to do prisoner of war interrogation. That was the largest component of the training that they did. They learned these things in fake German villages that were constructed at Camp Ritchie, often from the permanent force, which was known as the Composite School Unit, which today we might call the OPFOR or Opposition Force. They did some of their training in these sorts of conditions, where there was visual demonstration showing how to conduct assaults or interrogations using cutaway houses like you see pictured here. They conducted raids and POW captures, then did interrogations on each other or on members of the Composite School Unit. They attended fake Nazi rallies to understand the psychology of Nazism, which this and the previous picture show you the some of I'm not exactly what, we'll just talk about the conundrum of training for this, where you had Jews dressing up as Hitler and portraying Hitler, or in this case, the person who's portraying Goebbels was not Jewish, but this is what you had going on at Camp Ritchie. They actually studied German army equipment that was specially shipped to the camp, and they ran exercises against that equipment, which was manned by the Composite Service Unit, here seen in a German half-track. Now, perhaps their most important contribution in understanding the structure and organization of the enemy armies, the German army in particular. Camp Ritchie eventually spawned something called the Military Intelligence Research Service. The Military Intelligence Research Service produced books called Red Books, which detailed the German order of battle and they did similar kinds of books related to the SS and the Nazi Party. So these were incredibly important, and I'll explain why. If you are in the field and you come up against the enemy, you want to know the unit, how it is equipped, what it has in reserve, and how it's organized. Knowing this is critical to actually adapting your tactics so that you can hit their weak spots and gain victory. Additionally, these books provided incredible information for battlefield interrogators who could use their knowledge to convince POWs that they already knew all the important information. And so that whatever the POW said was just, was not really that important. It allowed them to actually convince the POWs to speak. Now, the Ritchie boys were required to memorize entire books detailing the German order of battle. The best of the best were sent on special assignment closer to the Pentagon, where they actually assembled these red books, which they continually iterated and revised over the course of the war. And that included not just the German army, but the Italian and other Axis powers as well, and their tactics, which you see here pictured in this part of their material. Now, later in 1944, Japanese Americans also came to Camp Ritchie. Some had been recruited directly from internment camps run by the US Army. Most of the Japanese Americans, then known as Nisei, came after September 1944, a camp similar to Camp Ritchie, but for Japanese language and translation training had been set up in Minnesota, and it was called Camp Savage. However, as the war's focus changed, Camp Ritchie also pivoted and welcomed these Japanese Americans. Even though the Army raised Nisei regiments, which fought heroically in Italy and across Europe, it forbid Japanese Americans from becoming officers and would not allow them to serve in combat in the Pacific, though they could serve in support roles. Thus, the primary role of the Nisei at Camp Ritchie was to translate Japanese war documents. Along with officers from Great Britain, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, that's what they did. This translation program was actually called PACMIRS, or the Pacific Military Intelligence Research Service. And it was run by Siegfried Gronich, a Moravian-born Jewish officer whose family had emigrated to the United States in the late 1920s. Gronich had graduated from Camp Ritchie's second class, served in North Africa and Italy, and founded the Military Research Service branch in London and staffed it with Ritchie boys. Despite impediments, the PACMIRS team made impressive breakthroughs and was able to publish extensive reports in short order. They had millions of documents they were asked to translate. The Camp Ritchie Women's Auxiliary, not then known as the Women's Army Corps unit, which included some translators and instructors that were on the permanent staff at Camp Ritchie, was augmented with Nisei WACs, producing a real, inclusive, and multinational joint environment. As you saw on my first slide, Sugi Hurt, one of the Nisei WACs, remarked that, quote, "I felt that I belonged here. I feel that I am American, and I feel that I was just as much American as any white person," close quote. Not all Nisei, however, particularly the men, felt included. At Camp Ritchie, they ran exercises, sometimes forced, as you see here, to actually be the enemy, creating an awkward dynamic in which many Nisei found offensive and indicative of the Army's mistrust and enduring racism. And they didn't need to look far for other signs of overt racism. It was found in the materials Camp Ritchie itself used for the courses to teach how to recognize Japanese uniforms. These are some of the materials that are used, and I'm gonna let you take a look at this one. This is perhaps the worst example that I've found. So while Jewish refugees generally felt included and Japanese Americans may have felt somewhat included, inclusion generally did not extend to Native Americans or African Americans. Both African Americans and Native Americans had segregated quarters. African Americans were regularly assigned duties requiring strength and stamina, conforming to stereotypes white officers frequently held of them. Like in the rest of the Army, African Americans primarily were transporters, moving arms and equipment around the camp. Although the first Ritchie class included a trilingual African-American officer, Leroy Woodson, because Blacks were forbidden to command whites, he was shunted around various units in the US and only shifted to the 92nd Infantry Division, the only African-American unit to see action in Europe, and deployed to Italy 2 years after finishing his training at Camp Ritchie. Renowned baritone William Warfield, pictured here, was part of the permanent staff at Camp Ritchie, and as a sergeant was charged with overseeing the theater and recreational facilities. This again conformed to white stereotypes about Blacks as entertainers. Despite his knowledge of 3 European languages, he was never utilized, deployed, and only his singing talents were taken advantage of. And Schenderlein points out what became obvious to many Jews at Camp Ritchie. Quote, anti-Semitism was not unusual in the army, but segregation taught Jewish refugees another lesson, that while they might not have been treated as equals, whatever animosity they might meet, they were still white. Evidence of this can be found in individuals, like Frederick Henderson, Lieutenant Frederick Henderson, pictured here, an Apache officer who spoke multiple languages and passed as white. Henderson graduated from Camp Ritchie and served on an interrogation team headed by David Rockefeller, scion of the Rockefeller family. Henderson went on to a long Army and CIA career. He, however, was an exception. Native Americans, as I mentioned before, were part of the permanent staff at Camp Ritchie, numbering nearly 200. But also conforming to stereotype, they were frequently deployed as the opposition force, acting as Germans, Italians, or Japanese in field exercises and in uniform equipment and tactics demonstrations because of the myth of the warrior native. As I mentioned earlier, the largest minority contingent at Camp Ritchie were Jewish immigrants. And they had much more freedom and were more fully incorporated into Army service than any other marginalized group. But that did not mean that they were immune from prejudice or that they were able to escape stereotypes that they themselves may have inadvertently supported. Unlike African Americans, Native Americans, and most of the WACs, Jewish officers helped to transform the camp and the content it taught and produced. In addition to spawning both the Mears and the Pack Mears, Camp Ritchie also birthed Camp Sharp. Once it started operating in January of 1944, many Ritchie graduates attended for specialized training in field training and training in psychological warfare. The preponderance of Jews in Camp Sharp was so high that some dubbed the camp, quote, Camp Shapiro. Mobile broadcast units, which issued calls for surrender right at the front and also produced leaflets to persuade the enemy forces, had shown promise in North Africa and in Italy. In Tunisia, an entire German regiment surrendered after being leafleted about the hopelessness of its position. And you see an example of these leaflets, not from North Africa, but these were the ones that were used and were found to be the most effective. If you had Eisenhower's signature on it, those were the ones that seemed to work. But you also see a picture of a tank here. And this is one of the examples of the mobile broadcast unit. This was a talking tank that would go right to the front and would broadcast calls in German for surrender. Now, I don't have time to discuss the details of Camp Sharp, but I want you to look a little bit at what some of the, in addition to what you see here about what they did, about the way they presented themselves. Even though most were handpicked, Ritchie graduate and polymath Hans Haba, himself a Hungarian of Hungarian Jewish origin. You see him in the top, right in the center sitting. Camp Sharp grads, it appears, trafficked in long existing stereotypes about Jews in the propaganda that they created about themselves. The paragraph troopers, as they were sarcastically known, or as they called themselves, pictured here, their reputation, even as they saved lives and risked their own and occasionally lost their own, was as overweight, front-phobic intellectuals armed with typewriters and not guns. You see that picture in the center. Even at Camp Ritchie, some non-Jews were open about their disdain for their comrades. Ritchie boy Klaus Mann reported hearing a sergeant say, quote, "Whenever I see a Jew, I feel like punching him in the nose." One imagines that this was not an isolated incident. So allow me to draw some interim conclusions. Gary Gersel argues that the myth of the heroic multi-ethnic platoon, first formed by Teddy Roosevelt and then forged in World War II, is perhaps the most powerful nation-building narrative that we have. In many ways, Camp Ritchie was that American myth. It was a true cosmopolitan idyll, a place where people from different backgrounds unified in defense of the ideals that allowed them to share the same classrooms. The Ritchie Boys episode shows us that despite racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism that was rampant among the pre-World War II Army officer class, despite our country's mistreatment of Japanese Americans, elements within the Army, perhaps reluctantly, stumbled on the benefits of diversity. In Camp Ritchie, we see an Army beginning to behave as a somewhat inclusive meritocracy, rather than as a standardized meat grinder, selecting and sending those with particular talents and special motivation to get information, whether as mobile broadcast units on the front line, as part of interrogation teams you see here, or as scouts even beyond the front, and turn that information into intelligence. Even belatedly doing the same with Japanese Americans, Camp Ritchie revealed an Army that was changing, even if only because of necessity. Thus, it does show how far America moved as an Army and as a polity. But bringing attention to Camp Ritchie not only helps to combat the myth about Jews as shirkers, and it also brings attention to critical contributions made by other marginalized soldiers, particularly Japanese Americans, to the defense of America. It also shows how central a specific brand of Protestant male whiteness remained in the World War II era concepts of national belonging. It forces us to consider the limits of the Army's understanding of diversity's value. And despite the contributions of Jews at the front and of graduates of Camp Ritchie, anti-Semitism continued to infect the Army, visible in the actions of General George Patton, in Bibles circulated in the Army as late as 1945, which blamed Jews for the death of Jesus, and even in doggerel and in offensive parodies circulated amongst troops. Again, for the benefit of those online, I will read this emblematic poem. This poem was titled A Christmas Poem, and it was, unsigned, but thousands of copies apparently were distributed throughout the Army by, we don't know who. O little town of Bethlehem, for Christmas gifts see Abraham. At Christmas get a tree of pine and buy the balls from Silverstein. Down the chimney Santa drops with toys bought from Isaac Blotz. Bring out the old, ring in the new, and help fatten up some dirty Jew. Hark, the herald angels sing, buy from cats a diamond ring. Our Savior was born on Christmas Day, levy gives you 6 months to pay. Peace on earth, goodwill to many, hawk your things with Uncle Benny. Silent night, holy night, damned if I don't think Hitler's right. This is what people in the Army were reading. That's pretty depressing, isn't it? Okay. But going forward, the story becomes more positive. So I won't leave you at that. My intent is not to stop in my research, not to stop with the end of the war, but to follow the exploits of Ritchie graduates who did not only important work in interrogation of war criminals, work in the occupation governments, and then more importantly, they helped to shape the post-war world. So we're now at part 3 of my talk, which is going to allow us to talk about some of the incredible graduates of Camp Ritchie and their varied and impressive contributions to post-war America. Yes. Sure. There was very little language training, German language training. There was some German language training, but most people who were selected that were German speakers already had the German when they came. Okay.
And the other question was, did anybody study psychological effects of soldiers dressing up as Nazis?
No, and I yes, I'm sorry for that. So the question that was asked, 2 questions were asked. One was German taught at Camp Ritchie? There was some German language instruction, but not much. Most of it was assumed that the people came with German language instruction. The second question was there any study done of the psychological effects of having whether Germans or Japanese American, born Americans or Japanese born Americans dress up as the enemy. No, not as far as I'm aware. And there are not, it's difficult enough even to find some of the training materials. Not the studies of the impact of the camp are very, very limited. Okay, were there any other questions? Those are great. Oh, we have got some questions in the, so if you could just nice and loud and I'll repeat it.
The Indians had code talkers
Mhm.
that they used throughout Europe. Were they trained?
They were elsewhere. So code talkers were used both in World War I and in World War II, but not, they were separate from Camp Ritchie. So that was a different thing. But it's interesting that you raised that, because there is a movement now to try to get recognition for the graduates of Camp Ritchie as a unit, as a group. And there are some precedents for that, such as the code talkers or the Tuskegee Airmen, who were recognized as a group because they were generally prejudiced against as a group. Yes.
I noticed that many of these photographs seem to have been staged publicity type photographs. Who was this publicity aimed at?
This was not, you're right that some of these were actual, they weren't staged, they were used for training materials within the camp. And they were then sent to the G2, or which was Army intelligence, to tell them and show them what was going on. So there were generally tours done by Army higher ups. And so any of these things that look staged were generally staged for that. Okay, not for the, it was the existence of Camp Ritchie was an open secret. There were people in the area of Western Maryland who occasionally would see German tanks on their farm. And so they were somewhat aware of things going on. And they were told, don't worry, this is not an invasion. So, so the existence of the camp was known, but what exactly they were doing at the camp was not. Yes.
Where was Camp Ritchie in Western Maryland?
So it is, it's a camp it's about 3 hours west of Washington, D.C. Let me see, it's about an hour and a half from Gettysburg. And the camp existed first as a resort set up by an individual. Then it became a possession of the state of Maryland. They used it as a National Guard training base. And then it was turned over to the Army in World War II. Existed as an Army base until the early 2000s, when it was closed as part of the base realignment efforts. Okay. Yes. Was English required as a second language? The assumption was that everyone knew English. So all the instruction was in English, but often the discussions that you read or you hear from the oral histories and any of the accounts of people who were at Camp Ritchie is that the language of everyday interaction was often not English. And so this is part of the dynamic that I want to get more into, is how does that then affect the way people perceive the idea of what it means to be American if they are involved in this kind of cosmopolitan experience that doesn't necessarily, it's not necessarily representative of what other parts of the country might experience. Yes. Were any of the Ritchie boys killed during the war? Yes, there were scores, if not hundreds of Ritchie boys killed during the war. One particular example that I would point out is from actually example from the state of New York. A man named Kurt Jacobs and Murray Zappler were 2 of 6 members of an interrogation team. They were caught in an envelopment at the Battle of the Bulge. And they were both summarily executed because they were Jewish, and they were both German Jews. And so the Nazis who captured them summarily executed them. After the war, once the tide of the battle turned, the colonel who ordered that summary execution had his own summary trial at the hands of the unit that had been captured. the American unit, and he too was executed. Yes.
Is Camp Ritchie still intact?
Is Camp Ritchie still intact today? And if someone went there, what would they see? I would not say it's intact. There are the remnants of a camp, and there's a conglomerate that has bought it up and is planning to restore it and make. I think part of what they've negotiated to do is that several of the buildings will be opened as a museum eventually, and the rest will be redeveloped. But it is somewhat in disrepair, but it's a beautiful area. It was, if you think about it, it's in the mountains of Western Maryland. It was as I said, it started its career as a resort, and it's a beautiful area. It has a beautiful lake, it's a nice setting. So hopefully it is something that could become an attraction once again. Okay, let me tell you about some of these great Americans. So in fact, many of them, and this is the part that I think is most attractive to me, is that so many of these men, mostly men, a handful of women, went on to incredible careers in the United States and really helped shape the post-war world. So Henry Arnhold is one example. He's the scion of the Jewish family who owned the largest bank in Germany, largest private bank in Germany prior to the Nazi takeover. And he became one of America's leading bankers. And like John Kluge, who was also or Kluge, I guess is how he went here, who was also a Ritchie boy and founder of Metro Media, Kluge and Arnhold became incredible philanthropists. And if you go do anything down in New York, you'll probably find a number of things named after them. And they were just two of the people who were kind of titans of industry and finance who passed through Camp Ritchie. I've already mentioned Hans Habe, but Stefan Heim, J.D. Salinger, Klaus Mann, and Max Diamant were just a few of the world famous novelists and producers of historical works who graduated from Camp Ritchie. How many of you have played Atari Pong? Then you know another Ritchie boy. Ralph Baer was the inventor of video games, much to probably the chagrin of many of us. But he was a Ritchie boy, a German Jewish immigrant. When you've traveled, who's used photo guides? Okay, a few people have. Eugene Fodor, a Hungarian Jewish emigre, famous for those travel guides, was also a Ritchie boy. And not only that, he graduated from Camp Sharp as well. Robert Goheen, born in India, became president of Princeton, and he was not the only college president among the Ritchie boys. There were scores of individuals, several college presidents, but also scores who went on to storied academic careers. These included physicists like Henry Kolm, who invented the maglev, the historians like Clemens von Klemperer and Arno Mayer, whose quote you saw at the beginning, and the words he chose for the first quote at the beginning, he's written a little bit more eloquently since then. Psychologists, philosophers, political scientists, linguists, legal scholars, and more came from Camp Ritchie. Eric Pleshko went on to run United Artists and Orion Pictures, and he was one of several who played a substantial role in America's post-war culture industries. Camp Ritchie produced future editors of the New York Times, the New Yorker, newspapers across the country, as well as a handful of publishers. Many served, or not many, but some served as ambassadors. Walter Shifter, Vernon Walters, John Doleybaugh, Robert Goheen were all ambassadors in multiple places. Some were governors, senators, and many were critical to the establishment of America's response to the Cold War. The founder of Voice of America was a Ritchie boy grad, as were the founders of America House. Several hundred participated in the Office of Strategic Services, the precursor to the CIA, and several played roles in the founding of the CIA, the NSA, and other parts of the Cold War US government. Now, there's two particular examples from the New York area whose stories I want to tell you. One is Arnold Hecht. He was born in Munich in 1924. His father, a textile salesman, Willy Hecht, was jailed in Dachau right around this time, 83 years ago, as a result of Kristallnacht. Arnold eventually was able to flee to England, and he got out of England just before the start of the war and arrived in the United States.
Well,
He
I
joined the
got it,
Army
but I
when he
don't
was
hear
18
anything.
and was sent to Camp Ritchie, where he graduated in late October 1944. He was shipped off to Europe and deployed as part of an IPW, or Interrogation of Prisoners of War team, in late November 1944. In Europe, his method of interrogation was indirect. He was often sent into the prisoner of war camps dressed in a German uniform, and he just mingled about and gathered information in that way. After the war, utilizing the GI Bill, Arnold received a degree in electrical engineering. He was first employed at a massive defense contractor, Frey, which made electronics, especially gyroscopes, for the armed forces. Frey, if some of you may remember, had a massive facility on Lake Success in Long Island. He later went on to Grumman Aerospace in Bethpage, where he worked on the development of the first lunar module, possibly alongside some of the very Nazi scientists we ferreted out of Germany and who Ritchie boys were placed in charge of interrogation of. But that's another story for another time. There actually was just a new documentary about this that came out a couple days ago. A second example, Max Lerner. Max was also born in 1924, but in Vienna. He went to the top school in Vienna, but was expelled when the Nazis annexed Austria in 1938, and his family fled to Paris, as many Jewish Austrians did. After 3 years of challenges, they finally secured visas to the United States, and in April 1941, they arrived safely in New York. When he turned 18, Mr. Lerner enlisted in the US Army, knowing if he didn't, he would eventually be drafted. But he was eager to be involved in the war. Because he had German and French, having lived in France for 3 years, he was assigned to the MTIC at Camp Ritchie. And almost a year after volunteering, so it took him until basically 1944, he became an American citizen. He went back to Europe as an American soldier in March 1944. He was recruited by the OSS, or the Office of Strategic Services, and he conducted a whole variety of secret missions. He later served as a special agent in the Counterintelligence Corps. Now, in addition to the secret missions, he has what I would call somewhat of a, he was everywhere where action happened in Europe. He was involved in the liberation of Paris, the city that he had fled 3 years before, on the lead tank. He was the translator for General Leclerc, the French general who headed the Free French Second Armored Division, which liberated the city. He helped the US Army cross the Rhine. Some of you may have seen the movie The Bridge at Remagen. In this picture you see here, this is Max. You see I crudely circled the German Army cap, the service cap that he's wearing. That was part of a whole German uniform that he had. He and a group of other Ritchie boys went across the river. This is just training. This is not actually a picture of what he did, but they went across the river in boats like this, across the Rhine, and dressed as German officers, snuck into the German camp and blew up an arms depot that could have been used to blow up the bridge, preventing the American crossing at Remagen. So after Germany's surrender, Max was involved in a number of interrogations of high-value Nazis. He was involved in the short-lived denazification effort, and he returned to the US in January 1946 and made a career working in import and export. I have had the good fortune to not only know Max, but to bring him to West Point to speak, and just 2 weeks ago to interview a still living and still vital Max Lerner. So we finally arrived at my lecture's final point. How does this relate to the work that I do in my position as West Point's director of the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies? So I'd put the mission up here for you to read. I would argue that while the word diversity does not appear in the mission itself, understanding diversity and inclusion is absolutely central to the work that I do and absolutely necessary for the preparation of our armed forces' current and future leaders. Diversity and inclusion are not easy, which I believe the example of Camp Ritchie actually shows. The concepts have their detractors. Some people don't like the idea of the discomfort that diversity causes. Others have difficulty trusting people with different experiences or have problems communicating with those they perceive as unlike themselves. Thus, some see social diversity as leading to interpersonal conflict or as a threat to group cohesion. And I hope, as I've proven, that clearly was the position of the US Army Officer Corps in the first half of the last century. So today, what makes diversity an inherent good? Why is it valuable? Well, decades of research has shown that if you want to innovate, you need diverse teams and organizations. Diversity enhances creativity. It enhances empathy as differences begin to be better understood. It produces objectively better learning outcomes, and in business, greater income objectively. Now, for me and the work that I do, the stakes are even higher because diversity is a matter of national security. If one is ignorant or uninterested in the different troops one leads, one will not gain the trust of their unit. If one is ignorant or uninterested of the cultures and thoughts of others, one will not be able to relate to those with whom we must partner for purposes of national security. Most importantly, if one does not appreciate diversity, one will misunderstand the adversaries of the United States, threatening our national defense. In the same way, the intelligence folks in the 1920s and 30s misunderstood the threat, the so-called Jewish threat, because of the preconceived notions that they had. And finally, all atrocity involves some form of discrimination. And the worst of mass atrocities, genocide, occurs when societies and their leaders decide that they prefer homogeneity over diversity. And this is why understanding of how the Army wrestled with diversity, particularly through the lens of Camp Ritchie, is of value to our next generation of leaders. To be inspired by Jewish soldiers who escaped Hitler, became American in order to fight back, by Nisei soldiers who joined the war effort, even while their own government interned their families, and to be aware of African-American soldiers whose talents the Army squandered because it was unwilling to adapt its concept of diversity or because of its leaders' endorsement of or fear of deep racism among white America, is essential for us to know. So teaching these lessons and researching these issues are just some of what my center achieves, or some of the ways my center achieves its mission. Other elements of the center can be found here, and I'm happy to answer questions about other work my center does in the Q&A period, should you have questions. But otherwise, thank you very much for your attention, particularly to those of you online. And thank you again to all of you who played a role in making today's talk possible.
If you want to send a copy of this.
Yes, I see a question up front. Absolutely.
What's the volume, number of the Ritchie Boys? And, you know, indicate, share with us an isolated case here or a group here. What's the number of people?
So this is the other thing that is, I think, most intriguing about this. There were about 20,000 people who went through Camp Ritchie. There were about 15 or so thousand graduates of a full course and about, 11,000 or so graduates of the full course, the 8-week course. And then there were others who came for just partial courses. But there also wasn't a failure rate, right? Not everyone who came passed. So this is at most, we're talking 20,000 people, and the numbers are still slightly unclear though. Beverly Eddy in her recent book does a really good job of actually documenting how many came through each class. It was named after the governor of Maryland, whose first name I'm now forgetting. I think it might be Arnold Ritchie, but that was who the name of the camp. But to your point, one of the things that I know I've talked to a couple people, and so I had the good fortune of being able to talk about this on 60 Minutes. And in that episode, we talked more about the contributions, the specific contributions made by those who graduated from Camp Ritchie. And the Army's own official history, though the methodology is a little shaky, indicates that that reports were that 60 or so % of the actionable intelligence that was gathered on the Western Front came from the graduates of Camp Ritchie. That's pretty amazing when you think about it, because of course there were lots of people who were doing intelligence. They hadn't all been trained at Camp Ritchie, but we needed intelligence. And so a lot of this, even when Camp Ritchie grads went to England, for example, and were waiting for D-Day, they were instructing others on how to do intelligence while in England. And so there's a ripple effect to their training, and but they had a really overrepresented impact on not just what occurred on the Western Front, but also in Italy and in North Africa. Yes.
Was there a special insignia identified Camp Ritchie?
There was not a special insignia. So the question was there a special insignia that identified Camp Ritchie? No is the answer. And the reason for that is because they were then assigned to units. And so Camp Ritchie grads were immediately sent. Some of them worked in headquarters, most of them worked right on the front, and they were assigned to existing units in those areas. And so they just took the patch of whatever unit they were. Yes. Oh, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I know that in a lot of what happened through Camp Ritchie, at least, was the rank was not really that important, except in the case of interrogations. If you know anything, if many of you probably have served, if you know anything about the military, if a private walks into a room and tells a general to talk, even if that general is from another army, they're not going to do anything, right? It's not going to work. So the instructions for the interrogation team were for them to not actually have rank, but to walk into the interrogations and say that they had, that if their questions were made about rank, saying that they are the ranking person in the room. Right, that was their instruction. Most of them, however, were basically non-commissioned officers. So they were anything from a private to a technical sergeant or staff sergeant. Many of them were what were called Tech 3s, 4s, and 5s, and so they didn't have significant rank, at least the people here. Now, others in the Army, I'm sure that there are some examples of that we could find, but I don't know the answer of who in World War II was the highest ranking Jewish soldier. Yes, we'll start.
I understand that every Kissinger whose family escaped from Nazi Germany joined the army, and because of his native tongue was German, he did take part in some interrogations. Did he have any connection with Camp Ritchie?
Not with Camp Ritchie, but a lot of knowing, as you know, the period of the 1930s, we had tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of German refugees, German-speaking refugees, and we had a lot of people who had come earlier in the 1920s who actually were, or not a lot because the immigration was limited, but we had many German speakers in the United States, and so there were many who were simply brought into the Army and either joined the Counterintelligence Corps, which was separate from Camp Ritchie, or were taken into the OSS, or there were other parts of the Army that they could be assessed into. And Kissinger was one of those examples. Yes, we'll go here and then.
When was the concept of Camp Ritchie created?
It essentially operated, so the question was, when was the concept of Camp Ritchie created, and how long did it operate? So it really was created very quickly in the spring of 1942. And as I mentioned, that's one of the things, I don't know exactly what happened, how the decision was made, if it was just, there were a lot of decisions being made in early 1942 as we jumped into the war that were just basically, it sometimes was somebody saying, I think this is a good idea, I'm going to do it, and then asking for resources once they already had started. But there was a lot of haphazard kind of development. But the fact that we had, this is where we owe a lot to George Marshall. He was probably the most organized. There probably couldn't have been a better chief of staff than him because of the way he kept track of all of this stuff and really had a command of what the Army needed. So I don't yet know the answer to that. I hope to find out more in the archives once the archives have been closed for 2 years. Our national archives too have been basically off limits since COVID started. And so I'm hoping to get in the archives when I'm down in DC starting in January. And I'll tell you what, if I find the answer, I'll let you know. Yes. In, so the question is, how long has the Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies been in existence, and has recent racism affected support for it? So the first part is an easy question. The center has been in existence since 2010, and it's something I'm very proud of because I was able to bring it to my leadership and say, I think there is a big gap in the education that we're providing our cadets if we're not teaching them about mass atrocity, which is most often a function of conflict and war. Then we are not fully teaching them about what they need to be prepared to deal with. And so the Academy has supported the program, but it is like many of the things that West Point does, it's called a Margin of Excellence program. And that means that Congress doesn't give us the money for this. Congress gives us enough money to do what they think is the minimum to educate the next generation of lieutenants. And you can probably tell from what I said, to be honest with you, I think that that's a very limited concept of what it takes to be an officer. That we can't be thinking about just producing lieutenants. We have to be able to produce critical thinkers who are capable of leading the Army one day. And so when I teach at West Point, especially when I teach plebes or freshmen, I start every class by first, when I introduce myself, I tell them, some of you may serve the minimum. You may only be in the Army for 5 years. Someone else might actually be the next General Milley, right? Where one day you'll be the chair of the Joint Chiefs. I have to assume that could be anybody. So I have to educate you as if all of you could be that chair. And so in terms of racism and current events affecting this, I don't think that it's affected support for the center because support is privately, it's private, but I think it underscores the need for it, if at least. Yes. So we'll go over there. Yes.
I know that there were discrimination against German people in the United States. The point that there were actually camps for German refugees similar to what there was for the Japanese people. That kind of conflicts with the whole idea of Camp Ritchie.
I think you've made my point, right? Which is that one of the things I think is important about the study of history in general, but in particular a case study like this, is that we realize just how the George Stadiana said the past is a foreign country. And sometimes we forget that. We often look through our rose-colored glasses and look at the past as what we want to see, when actual study of the past shows us just how different it actually was. And there were leaders of the Bund who lived within 10 miles of here. the German American Bund and the pro-Nazi organizations who lived within 10 miles of here. And the fact that that happened and that existed a mere 80 some years ago is important for us to know, but it's also something that we have to realize just how far we've actually come from that position. That doesn't mean that everyone's happy. That doesn't mean that progress has been made equally for all groups of people, but it does show us that we have to look at the ways these different people have negotiated the contradictions of the time. So we'll go to the online one.
Yeah, two questions online. First, has anyone analyzed how training compares to other camps? And the soldiers who graduated from there earning higher ranks compared to soldiers from other areas?
So the question was, does anyone studied the training at Camp Ritchie, and then whether or not the achievements resulted in greater recognition compared to other training centers? I don't believe that that's been the case. There wasn't anything like that, and some of that is what I would say a somewhat problematic, not the question, but the answer to the question exposes a somewhat problematic part of our history. The Army has actually set up an organization that goes back and re-looks awards because it has realized that the awards that it gave out were often inflected through race. And what I mean by that is, especially in World War I and also in World War II, they've gone back and provided posthumous awards, medals of honor, to African Americans, to Jewish Americans, because their contributions were not fully recognized. They just, part of the endemic racism was that they weren't supported by their leadership. And so they didn't get written up in the same way. So rather than getting a Medal of Honor, they got a Bronze Star or something like that. And so in some cases, the Army has gone back and has rectified these issues. So a comparison of the awards is a problematic one just because of the nature of the award process in the Army.
And then the other question for center and what we do with other Holocaust centers in Europe. Others in the area.
Yes. Yes, we do. We work, I'm also part of help found a consortium of centers of higher education centers of Holocaust, Genocide, and Human Rights Studies. And so we have both a national and a regional version of that. And we do a lot of collaborative lectures, especially in this virtual age, where we can do a lot of work and attract people from different, each center does its own publication, it's its own press and its own recruitment of people, as we're doing today. And we're able to get great audiences for these events. In terms of working with other regional organizations, we work as much as we can over the last 2 years. And for those of you who have ever tried to get on West Point, even like Lisa and I who work at West Point, it's not easy even for us to get on. And so one of the problems in collaboration is that it's often easier to collaborate by having me do this kind of thing today than it is to try to bring you to West Point. Those things, I've done exhibits, I've done speeches, done all kinds of programs at West Point. Those are, I hate to whine, but we are the confluence of three great bureaucracies: the Army, the federal government, and academia. And we sometimes work that way. Yes. Mm-hmm. So the question was about is anti-Semitism on college campuses, are we seeing that at West Point? And I would say that it's not that it doesn't exist. There's some examples that show that it does, but it is probably far less of a problem at West Point than it is elsewhere for a couple of different reasons. Number one, we're the Army. We don't let people have political organizations. Okay, they have to be apolitical. And so you don't have student organizations who might be promoting certain ideas. You have student organizations at West Point, but they're activity-based. They're not based on promotion of political ideas. So number one. Number two, we also have a very close relationship with the IDF. And so we have programs that we do with them. We have a program actually where we send cadets with some folks from Yale to study the Israel-Palestinian issue, mixing with Israelis and Palestinians. We do work to try to combat anti-Semitism, and I'll, I hate to sound like I'm plugging myself, but I would say that the work that the center does is also very much tied to this. We have a project currently where we're looking at some of the problems of extremism on both sides and how they're utilizing anti-Semitic narratives and tropes in order to draw people into their orbits. Yes, sure.
And just to add on, the Army has learned from the mistakes of segregation and so on. So we have a great system where if anti-Semitism does pop up, I've had it in my classroom, so I like that one as well. And it's calling a tactical officer, and it's op-ed attacks. So we have that idea to chat us to stop those sentiments, those beliefs in the past.
I firmly believe, to echo what Lisa just said, that the way to deal with this is through education. Right? That we do a number of programs. For example, I take normally around 200 cadets in a regular year to the Holocaust Museum for a series of different programs. So one for plebes that takes about 80, that just is an introduction of a day to that problem, to the study of the Holocaust. And they get a chance to talk with a survivor and we discuss the issue of the Holocaust. I have another program where we actually look at the way the Nazis used law and the legal profession for purposes of persecution. And then we also look into war crimes. And then we do another program with the other academies where we have cadets come together who are doing with midshipmen, Coast Guard cadets, Air Force cadets, some ROTC folks, and have them present the material that they've studied that is related to atrocity and atrocity prevention amongst each other. So we do work to try to combat that, and we bring in speakers. Last year to answer the question about collaboration. One of the big collaborations we did in our regional consortium was to actually have one of the prosecutors from the Southern District and one of the leaders of the ADL come and talk about the problem of anti-Semitism. Yes. That's a good question. So one of as I was thinking about the comments that I was going to make at the beginning, and my, lesson number one is always something to disarm, right? You have to, something funny. So I remembered back when I was trying to figure out in my senior year of college, what was I going to do after I graduated college? And I took one of these inventories, and basically the result was either clergy or academic. And so now I'm here, and I figured so that was, you got me to use my other introductory comment. So I have not spoken in churches or mosques, but one of my partners is actually a partners in New York at Manhattan College, is one of the leading Islamic experts on the Shoah. So she's a Muslim, and she has studied the Holocaust and has written on the Holocaust. And so we're planning more of those things as time goes on. But thank you. And if you have any ideas, please let me know. Yes, ma'am.
I wanted to mention and thank you for what you've been doing. And you also, I'm a member of the office. They partnered with us in the best partnership program that are through our suffering. It's wonderful. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Yes, and I think that one of if there's any upside to COVID, as I look out at all the masks. It is that we have done much more in terms of collaboration online. And there are, one of the things that West Point has been is relatively insular, right? The education that we have has been mainly for our cadets. But I think that over time will begin to change, and we'll start to see that. And what I'm hoping, for example, is that more of the people that I'm able to invite, if we're able to stream their lectures, that more people can benefit from that. So very recently, just 2 weeks ago, I had Lieutenant General Romeo Dallaire, who was the commander of the UN force in Rwanda during the Rwandan genocide, give a public talk that we did stream. And so there were hundreds of people that were able to attend that. And we hope to do more of those sorts of things, collaborating with organizations like you. Yes, Rob?
You said that Congress doesn't consider the program essential enough to after they don't fund it. Is anyone doing anything to keep that mindset?
Well, I maybe I should walk that back a second. So what was asked was that I said that Congress does not consider what I do essential enough, and is anyone actually doing anything about that? And so I want to walk that back and say, I don't think Congress has ever sat down and talked and said, let's look at the center, and is that important enough? So what they have done basically is said, or they give money to the Department of the Army or Department of Defense, which gives the Department of the Army, which then makes the decision on West Point's overall budget. Generally, I think there's a good amount of money for education, but that education money is primarily, for those of you who might be less familiar with West Point, is primarily geared towards teaching the things we think are necessary. And one of the things that I learned early on, and I decided very clearly, was that I was not going to have a fight with my own faculty about whether my course was more important than physics or more important than philosophy. That all of those things are important because they are necessary to create critical thinkers. Okay. I can do programs, and this is what my center has done, in addition to working with it's the only center of its kind at any of the academies. None of the other academies have something like this. And so I work with the other academies and with the whole Army professional education structure. I can work with them and say, you tell me what you're teaching. I can help you integrate some concepts from Holocaust and Genocide Studies, atrocity prevention, into the work that you're doing. And I've found that rather than saying it's either 1 plus and 1 minus in the zero-sum game, what if we can actually both add? And I think that's been the, I hope, a more productive approach. Yes. Not to high schools. We haven't really worked with high schools, but the history department at West Point has worked with high schools, actually. So my wife is in the back, and she has actually hosted an RTC group that's come into Washingtonville High School. She teaches there. And so our history students have sometimes gone and talked about a variety of different things, including the study of history and including what it means to be an officer or what it means to be training to be an officer at Washingtonville. And those kinds of things. The one thing that you may see in me as an enthusiasm for where I teach, and I know Lisa shares this as well, we get to work with some pretty incredible people. And it's really a lot of fun, and they're inspiring to us, because they are so idealistic and they really want to make a difference and make the world better. And so if you get a chance to have them in your class in high school, if we can arrange that sort of thing, we can't do it now. We're not sending cadets to do those sorts of things at this point, but hopefully once the pandemic abates, we can start doing those kinds of things again. Yes.
Just want to wrap up a couple of comments online. Just one final question about how to get in touch with you. We had someone say that they didn't understand how pervasive anti-Semitism was in the American military and the U.S. leadership. They knew that the KKK and others were prejudiced and ignorant, but assumed that our leadership was more disinterested than activated. So that's, right. I would. And then the final question, if people want to get in touch with you, for more questions, is that a possibility?
Sure. There's a fairly easy way of doing it. It's my first name dot last name. So David.Frey, F-R-E-Y, at westpoint.edu. That's probably the easiest way of doing that. Okay. Thank you.
For coming today. Thank you all online for your wonderful questions and for supporting our program. If any of you have any ideas for future programs, please get in touch with us. My email is jewishorangeNY.org. Sorry, I'm blank there. So please let us know if you have any other ideas. For those of you here in the audience with us, we have a little goodie bag for you to take home with you for some snacks, since we're not able to obviously host, everyone in person, sort of coffee or whatever. So please take a bag with you, and thank you, and thank you, David, for this wonderful.